Bobby, I should have also told you that when you have your animal rights issues raised, David is the man to go to. It's his big research area.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to engaging about that in the future as well. Okay, but we on record now, so let's.
Right. Are we admitting, David?
We're admitting.
I admit.
We're live on Facebook now, and we are recording, and we have admitted, and we'll just wait for a minute because it's not quite half past. Great. Well, we've turned half past now, so just maybe give people, as the half hour comes, we just give people a chance. I'll just do some of the preliminaries now, so we can move straight into our presentations. So greeting to all those who are joining us both in South Africa and internationally for the 6th part in our 10-part series on climate change. I'm Professor David Bilchitz, Director of the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional Public Human Rights and International Law, SAIFAC in short, which is a center in the Faculty of Law at the University of Johannesburg, and we are delighted to be the hosts of the series. The series was created to bring together leading experts who would explore various aspects of climate change from the perspective of multiple disciplines. Through the carefully designed topics, we delve into science, law, policy, and social justice, and will expose participants to the key debates that occur in these areas. I want to pay tribute to the multidisciplinary organizing team who put this together for their vision and leadership. They are Professor Kitty Dumont, Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of South Africa, Dr. Jenny Hall, Department of Procedural Law, University of Johannesburg, who I'll introduce more, Professor Diane Hildebrandt, Director of the Institute for the Development of Energy for African Sustainability at the University of South Africa, Professor Lwazi Ngubabana, Director of the African Energy Leadership Center at Wits Business School, and Professor Colleen Fogel, Distinguished Professor, Global Change Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand. I also want to thank our partner Constitution Hill for their support and all those who have helped to advertise the series. From the SAIFAC side, I would like to thank Naomi Ho for her work on the administrative side and Ibrahim Karim for designing our posters. Tonight, we only have 100 places in the Zoom conversation, so if you're unable to get in, you are welcome to join us on the SAIFAC page on Facebook. We are streaming there as well, and we welcome our Facebook viewers. We are delighted to have with us today to deliver the keynote address, Joanne Yawitch, CEO of the National Business Initiative, and the focus of the topic will be on increasing pressure, increasing implications for business. From the role of business tonight, I would like also to draw your attention to the 7th seminar in the series, which will be titled We the People, Climate Change and Civil Society Responses, which will be focused on the role of civil society. We have two outstanding speakers there, Dr. Vishwas Satkar and Dora Marema, and more details on that seminar will be provided in the advertising. And please RSVP as usual to Naomi, although we are now publicizing the links generally in the posters. So I'm now going to introduce the chair for the seminar, Dr. Jenny Hall. Dr. Jenny Hall is a senior lecturer at the UJ Faculty of Law. She moved into academia full-time a couple of years ago after a career specializing in the environmental law and servicing all sectors, including drafting legislation, policy, and strategy. And one of the aspects Jenny has been involved with was drafting South Africa's first climate change discussion document for government, together with the late distinguished Professor Bob Scholes. So over to you, Jenny, and we look forward to a wonderful seminar. We also have a wonderful respondent who I didn't introduce, but I'm going to hand over to Jenny to do the honors.
Thank you, David, and welcome back, everyone, and welcome to new, somewhat distinguished guests that I see popping up. And to all those on Facebook, we can't see your names, but great to have you with us. So tonight we are shifting focus. Up until now, we've been looking at the different disciplines and how they can have an effect on each other. We've looked at science, we've looked at law, we've looked at psychology, but tonight we shift into the start of our saying, but what does society want? Because all of those theoretical academic exercises, we should be informed by the views of society. And we start off with a topic on business, increasing pressure, increasing implications for business. And what we've seen with judgments such as the Shell judgment that came out of the Netherlands recently this year is that business needs to be part of our venture. Climate change has now become urgent. They have to be part of the story, but there's different implications and different issues for countries such as South Africa, and there's always been tensions between developed countries and their businesses who've caused the problem in our country and our businesses who are still a part of an emerging economy. So it's a good time to have the topic. And tonight we've got a great speaker and respondent. They are both two of the best thinkers and strategists and negotiators that I know. They always give me a run for my money. The president obviously agrees with me because he's appointed both of them to his commission on climate change. We're going to start with Joanne Yawitch and follow up with Bobby Peake. Joanne has such a long CV, it's really hard to condense it, but she's currently CEO of the National Business Initiative, apart from being on the President's Commission. She was previously Deputy Director General at the Department of Environmental Affairs and responsible for the climate change portfolio. And before that was a Chief Director in the Gauteng province. She's also chair of a number of boards, including Sand Parks. So she sees the world through quite an integrated perspective. Joanne also has a host of degrees, and please forgive me, Joanne, I forgot. I started writing them down, but I think there's like 6 or 7 or something, so I didn't keep up with them. But for the academics amongst us, I can assure you that she's pedigreed on that score as well. Bobby he started an NGO called Groundwork many years ago, and he's been static in doing that. He's been at the coalface fighting social justice issues, and I think the work that Bobby has done in the last couple of decades has been seriously recognized by the fact that he now has an honorary doctorate for the efforts that he puts in. So he keeps all of us on his toes, and a brilliant respondent to have to the business perspective. No one better that we could get. So with that, I don't want to colonize the time. I'm going to hand over to Joanne.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you, in fact, for inviting me. And I certainly hope that in this distinguished academic audience that I can do justice to this topic. I come from a fairly practical space, I suppose, and maybe to talk a little bit about where I do come from. So the NBI is, it's a business non-profit organization. It is a membership organization. We have a membership of probably about 80 or 90 fairly large organizations, but an increasingly growing number of small ones. And we really look at the issues of socio-economic and environmental transformation and the role of business in that. And we have worked in the climate change space for a very long time. Starting in the early 2000s, we started linking up with international business organizations to address the issues of climate change and the implications of that for South African companies. And then have worked with those South African companies in order that they start to understand climate issues, integrate them into what they're doing, and are able to respond proactively to the questions of climate change. So given that this is number 6 in the series, I am presuming that there's a very clear understanding that climate change is an environmental issue, it's an economic issue, and it is also a human rights and justice issue, and many more besides. And so in looking at the business response to climate issues, one's got to take all of those into account. And I'm going to try and cover all of them in what I deal with in the next while. So first of all, I think that we need to, when we're looking at business, and particularly business in South Africa, in operating in our emissions intensive and coal-based economy, we've got to understand that the structural issues around addressing climate change are quite challenging. But at the same time, there are a set of pressures and issues that are forcing and pushing the private sector in South Africa to put climate change quite high up on its agenda. And really, I think that the global context is quite an important defining factor. And in terms of the global context, I think firstly is the fact that many countries in the world have already set ambitious net zero targets. There's a whole suite of countries that intend to reach net zero before 2050. Most of them are European countries, but in addition, Uruguay, for example, is in that list. Then there are all of the countries of the world who are intending to reach net zero by 2050. Again, a large number of European countries, but also the US. Chile is one of them, an important trade partner and competitor of South Africa. South Korea, Iceland, New Zealand are just some of those examples. And then post-2050, you've got countries like China, Singapore, Brazil, Russia have all indicated an intention to reach net zero after 2050. South Africa hasn't made any net zero commitments. However, our national low emissions development strategy says that we commit to ultimately moving towards a goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And so there is, I suppose, an aspirational goal to get there. I think that the issue of net zero by 2050 raises the question of how all of those countries are intending to get there. And if we look at the kinds of signals that are coming in particular from many parts of the developed world, there is a firm intention. Whether it will materialize into reality or not, I think is a different question and is going to be a long fight. But there's a clear intention to impose carbon border taxes on countries who do not reduce their emissions sufficiently. And it is not within the WTO rules, but nevertheless, countries like the UK and the US are very clear that they are going to, as is the EU, that the possibility of carbon border taxes is high up on the agenda. And South Africa's trade vulnerability is particularly acute. Our commodity trade balance is very open to transition risk. So if you look at our main exports and our main earners of foreign exchange, platinum group metals, coal, iron ore, gold, ferroalloys, motor vehicles and parts, chromium, our citrus, our unwrought aluminium, flat-rolled products of stainless steel, all of them, well, the citrus, I think, is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but all of the others have very high levels of firstly, very high levels of embedded carbon in them. But secondly, they are also commodities that as the world moves on to net zero and as the kind of technological innovation and advances that are necessary for that to happen take place, a lot of them are going to become less desirable, coal in particular. But apart from that, the issue of electric vehicles has huge implications for our automotive industry, unless we start to manufacture electric vehicles and start to adopt that technology. Our coal, I've spoken about our coal, our platinum group metals are similarly at risk, as are many of our exports. So for business in South Africa looking to the future, it is very, very clear that change is on the horizon and that change needs to happen. So I think really that's talking to, I suppose, some of the economic issues around climate change. And then on the other side of it is the issues of the impacts of climate change. And I'm sure in the seminar series, you've spoken at length about the level of vulnerability of South Africa to climate impacts, the threats to our biodiversity, the fragility of our water resources, the threats to our water resources, the threats to our capacity to ensure food security and to be able to continue to produce in the ways that we always had. They are significant. And that too is a major concern for the corporate sector. Then I think to talk a little bit about the justice issues, and the issue of the just transition is a key question for South African business. And I'm sure, again, we are one of the world's most unequal societies. We have nearly 50% of youth unemployment. Over 17 million of our people survive on social grants. More than half the population is living in poverty. And that has been hugely exacerbated over the last couple of years with the COVID pandemic. We've got high unemployment and a very high percentage of our population, in particular those over 26, 23% of the population has no formal education. So there's a huge social crisis in South Africa that plays into the climate crisis in particular ways. And when you put all of this together, the issues of transition are pressing and they are urgent. So what has business done in South Africa, and maybe to go back over the last decade or so, and where we essentially started off was with South African corporates beginning to disclose their carbon emissions, in particular through things like the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Program, but also as listing requirements and as the corporate reporting frameworks have developed, things like the GRI, like the United Nations Global Compact. South African, particularly large corporates, have begun to have and have been very good at disclosure. Then what companies, where that has got to eventually in the last few years is that disclosure of emissions has been integrated into two things, integrated into firstly financial reporting through measures like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and increasing numbers of South African corporates do respond to the TCFD. And then what you've had is the investor movement, which is a very important factor internationally in putting pressure on business to reduce its emission levels. And it's not only, in fact, the investor movement, it's the financial services sector in general is taking an increasingly hard line on supporting and financing and underwriting emissions-intensive industries. And they're doing it because they really are concerned about the risk of stranded assets into the future. And that has put pressure on South African corporates increasingly. We are we are part of a global economy, and most big corporates in South Africa have investors who are both domestic and international. And in many cases, those international and domestic investors are starting to ask increasingly pointed questions around the climate change and mitigation strategies that corporates have. And then what you've had is various programs internationally that South African corporates have also been part of. So you have international business organizations, groupings like We Mean Business, for example, which is a coalition of international business organizations working to support climate ambition. And it has programs like an energy efficiency program and a renewable energy program. And it has sets up things like frameworks for commitments by corporates. And what we've seen over the last decade as this issue has become more and more of, I suppose, a current and pressing concern for corporates, is South African companies joining along with international companies engaging in these programs. Where are we now at the current period? And I think that in the last couple of years, corporate South Africa has taken quite a giant leap forward. I think in part, partly out of a response to things like the carbon tax, partly out of a response to the issues of carbon taxes, the introduction of carbon budgets, the international movements of business post-Paris have all played a role. But I also think at a more domestic level, the electricity supply crisis has really focused businesses' mind around what is going to constitute a sustainable and feasible form of powering their enterprises and their businesses into the future. And where we have got to at this point in time, and is that over the last year or so, the NBI, together with the Business Unity South Africa and Boston Consulting, have done quite a big and quite a rigorous piece of work in order to, we asked the question as to whether we could see net zero pathways to 2050 for South African companies, both in relation to the issues of mitigation as well as to the issues of adaptation. And we've worked with a grouping of 27 CEOs, some of them from the country's biggest emitters, some of them from sectors impacted by climate change, so including the forestry sector, the food sector, agriculture. And what we've tried to do is to determine whether we can see the way towards a net zero 2050 plan in South Africa. And what I want to do is to, and can we do it in a way, if we can reach net zero by 2050, how do we do it in such a way that we start to reindustrialize our economy? How do we do it so that we start to develop a differently skilled workforce? And how do we do it in a way that we take cognizance on the impact on communities and workers of factors that will fundamentally change industries and ensure that some industries, in fact, are phased out. So, for example, the coal industry, and what do we do about all of the people in the value chains that currently support those industries at the same time, at this point in time? So the issues of just transition, I think, were very integrated into the way that we've looked at 2050. And essentially, in brief, our conclusion is that there are viable pathways to a net zero 2050 for the South African economy. We believe that it is, there are a set of pathways that open significant opportunities for the economy as a whole. We believe that these pathways require some bold thinking and some bold planning. It requires collaboration right across society. So it requires government, business, labor, civil society, academia, the science fraternity to all come together to work jointly on these plans. And it requires, from the side of government, I think in particular, some bold statements of ambition. So what is our plan? Essentially, what we have done, and we did huge amounts of data collection and data modeling. We worked in a workshop type process with many industry experts and academic experts, and came to the conclusion that a renewables dominant energy system is going to be the least cost solution to an energy transition in our country. We looked at a coal and carbon capture and storage dominant system. We looked at a nuclear energy dominant system. And whichever way you model it and whatever sensitivities apply, you come up with the same answers, which is that a renewable dominant system has the lowest cost and also the narrowest risk envelope or variability in cost. There are obviously challenges, including, I think, some quite big challenges around the improvement of our transmission grid, but nevertheless, that was the conclusion. The second conclusion that we came to is that in order to get to net zero by 2050, what you've got to do is to overbuild renewables. You've got to put huge resources into building renewable power capacity at a significant level. I think that we also are presuming in this work that battery storage and the technologies around battery storage are going to improve quite rapidly. But that if you build renewables, what we discovered, if you build at sufficient scale, you start to be able to create the base for reindustrialization, and you start to create the basis in order to be able to employ more people over a longer period of time than you do if right at the end, when you get towards 2040, you suddenly say, okay, let's look at an energy transition at this point in time. So what we then did was to model that against the emissions reductions that you could achieve by doing that, and came to the point where you end up with 9 or 10 megatons of carbon, maybe up to anything up to 15, between 9 and 15 megatons of carbon that are very hard to get out of the system. And our conclusion with those is that you've got to then do two things. The first thing is that our model assumes some level of gas infrastructure development in the economy, particularly for use in the 2030s and 2040s, that will support peaking and intermittency. But for that last mile decarbonization, our solution is really around the development of a green hydrogen industry in South Africa, and looking at new technologies, new and unproven as yet technologies, but that have great promise around things like direct air capture. And what that does is to create a set of opportunities for companies that are heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry, like Sasol, for example, to change course and to see themselves as producers of green hydrogen, green ammonia, green aviation fuel, and green chemicals. And for that to really start to open up new industries and new opportunities for our country, also new opportunities for the agriculture sector. And South Africa is really well positioned to be able to play in the green hydrogen space. Our main competitors are countries like Australia and Saudi Arabia, but a lot of work has been done to look at the possibilities of being able to build this as an industry. And I'm sure you will have seen that Sasol and Toyota, for example, have now gone into partnership in order to be able to look at the possibilities of green hydrogen, and then if you you're also looking at Eskom making increasingly vocal and clear pronouncements on how it sees renewables and renewables development as an absolutely central part of their business model going forward. What does this require to happen? I've talked about the kind of collaboration and the kind of vision that we're going to need, but it also needs quite significant financing and investment if we're going to get this off first base. And where I get it off first base, and where this work, I think, has ended up at this point in time, is to look at how South Africa can take the opportunity and the window of opportunity that is open, potentially open, in the international community at the moment, in the run-up to COP26, to put a very clear decarbonization plan on the table for the country, and to be able to use a greater statement of ambition that is in the NDC that was put out for comment, in order to be able to convince the international community to invest in South Africa as a country where you can really would be able to prove, firstly, achieve quite significant levels of emissions reduction internationally, but also be able to have proof of concept in terms of the possibilities of radical decarbonization. So I think, interestingly, I would say that behind this plan, this is our energy sector plan. We are currently also doing work in the mining sector. We've done work in the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, and are now looking at transport. So we are slowly starting to cover the economy sector by sector. Hopefully we'll be finished in kind of the next year or so, and we'll tie all of this together. Is that we think that there are solutions, and I think quite amazingly, given where we started and where we were even 3 or 5 years ago, what I want to say is I think that we have probably the vast majority of large business in South Africa behind quite a seriously ambitious climate change mitigation plan. And with the work that we're doing in the Afolu sector and in transport, as well as the work that we're doing around the just transition, and we're doing quite a lot of economic modeling and economic research, particularly in the Mpumalanga area, I think that we are starting to generate a plan for South Africa that we certainly hope that we can persuade our government to buy into, and our government to support along with other stakeholders. And I think that with that, we might be able to turn some of the climate risk that we face in the country into a set of opportunities that could leverage some very, very significant social, economic, and environmental benefits and co-benefits. So I think that the last thing to say is climate positive programs leverage, I think, social benefits, and then they leverage a set of associated environmental benefits. So if you look at the issue of air quality, for example, if to a significant extent, Eskom's decommissioning of their power stations means that those power stations are going to be repurposed as renewable hubs, for example, obviously you're going to have an increase in the quality of the air in the areas where those power stations are. That's one example of co-benefits. Another example of a co-benefit is, I'm sure people will have seen that most of the large mines with this intention to raise the limit on unlicensed renewable infrastructure up to 100 megawatts could mean that the excess electricity that mines could produce could be used to power adjacent rural communities. So I think that there's a virtuous cycle that we have to look at, but I don't, it's a good plan, I think, but I think that fundamentally, as with everything, the devil is in the detail, and the devil is in our capacity to implement. And I think that as a country, we aren't terribly good at implementation, but I think that this is something that, with the kind of will that is behind this, is something that is really worth doing and worth trying to achieve. So I think I'll stop there, Jenny, and yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say. You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, they're right. Thanks so much. And my head's buzzing, and I've got my own 15 questions that I'd like to follow up on, but I see you've stimulated the same kind of questions in the chat box, and please do keep those questions coming. I'm trying to make a note. I'm going to ask my co-host to help me keep note of them. But in case Bobby gives you a run for your money and offsets some of those things or asks some of those questions, I think what I'm going to do is hand over to him, and we'll take questions at the ends that you can both engage at the same time. So Bobby, thank you again for being with us. Over to you.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Joanne. So yeah, I think firstly, just to give everybody an understanding of who Groundwork is. And so Groundwork is an environmental justice organization that has been around since 1999. And essentially, we've worked on energy issues since day one. I mean, the first struggle was the Engen oil refinery. The second struggle was the toxic waste companies, and then the third struggle was Sasol in that particular order. So Waste Tech, EnviroServe, Jenny knows. Smile, Jenny, please, when we mention EnviroServe. So that's the history of helping and working with people who live next to these industries to be able to respond to the environmental injustices that come to be brought to bear upon them by these industries. And that has remained the same. So we work throughout Africa now, and we work, believe it or not, even in Africa with governments, advising governments. But essentially, we work with people, we protest, we'll get arrested, we go to jail, and we burn tires. And yes, it's air pollution, don't say anything, keep quiet. So I have to agree with Joanne. I think that's the most important thing. There are some things that we can't deny that I think we're coming together on. And one is that climate change is being used in the global economy to redefine the power of the North again as they keep out the South in terms of trade. But that's our own doing, by the way. I don't think we should always blame the elite in the North. We need to recognize that we have our own comprado or our own elite in the South that have actually led us down this path. I often say that, you know, when one looks at telephone technology, we did not, America's got landlines that covers the entire, you know, the US and Canada. Europe's got landlines that covers all of Western Europe. What happened was in Africa, we didn't go and lay landlines down. We just jumped. We went from no phones to cell phones. And I think that's what's needed in this debate. So that's about the economy. I think we need to recognize that the issues around a just transition is important, and it's good that the business sector is taking this up. The question is, how do they define a just transition? The fact that, you know, Joanne has spoken about disclosure, I think that is important, that there is these levels of disclosure by industry, but I think the challenge lies in disclosure to whom and on what, and that's really the important thing. I think the reindustrialization of our economy is critical, and again, have to support Joanne in thinking about how do we reindustrialize our economy together, but also reindustrialize our economy for what purpose? And is it the purpose for capital accumulation? Is it the purpose to grow the economy, which does not provide growing and securing services for people? So I think that is really important when we think about the economy and growing it and reindustrializing it. We have to understand and ask opportunities for whom. So essentially, I think Groundwork has been working on the just transition since at least I can say 2005 in terms of the terminology. And we said then, if we need an energy transition to renewable and alternative energies, the only way that that transition will be successful if it's done with people and with movements and is responding to those needs of people on the ground. And we know that the renewable energy sector today builds all these renewable energy IPP plants, but it's money in the bank for them. Firstly, you know, it's not going into our economy in a way that the money is taken offshore. Two is that there's been serious critiques about the renewable industries social labor plans with communities around them. So that for us is a serious problem. So that's what we think when we speak about a just transition. How does the energy process, how does, when we change that, we work with movements, and people are needing services. So over the years, we've spoken with communities in the Vaal Triangle, in South Durban, on the Mpumalanga Highveld. And, you know, we've spoken about energy. What do they understand? What do they mean by energy? And eventually, in 2016, we also looked at how the coal industry was imploding and how it was damaging the Highveld, people, lives, and land. And what is clear from those debates on the destruction of the Highveld communities were saying that they need a new tomorrow. And that debate then ended up in 2019 producing what we think is the first type of blueprint for a South African just transition, a just transition for people, not a just transition for industry. And we're very clear about that. And over the years, working with EarthLife Africa, working with the Center for Environmental Rights, we have taken that and we've developed what we call an open agenda for just transition. And we say, and we have 12 points, which I just want to speak to very quickly. It's a new energy system that replaces the present system. We have to stop money to dirty industry and dirty energy. We have to rehabilitate all the land and the water that's been ruined. We have to prepare for the impacts of climate change because that is coming at us and that has to be on our agenda. A health system needs to be developed that responds to the challenges that we face. Transport and communication systems must allow for the type of ease of movement and the inclusion of all people. Food is critical, as we've seen over the last 2 weeks in KwaZulu-Natal. I've stood in a bread queue to get bread over the last 2 weeks because the system was disrupted. So I think we need to think of food sovereignty for all. We need to think of service delivery. So I've mentioned this in the Presidential Commission, is that just transition means service delivery for people. It doesn't mean energy and industrialization only. It thinks we have to talk about a new economic system, and I think that's where we come into partial alignment with regards to the reindustrialization. And we need to be able to think of how does the economy serve people rather than profit. We need gender justice, which is critical in South Africa in terms of a just transition. And we need to be able to think of the future and of youth. And critically and finally, and this is where it goes back to exactly your debate on disclosure, it needs an open democracy so that there are clear decision-making processes that people are aware of, and it's not hidden. And when we talk about open democracy and we talk about disclosure, we need to think of, is the industrial sector in South Africa really on board with disclosure? And I have to disagree with Joanne on that. I think they can craft language for the global scene so that they can tick a box. But if you go to the VAL, it took a legal case by the Center for Environmental Rights and the VAL Environmental Justice Alliance to the Supreme Court of Appeal to force ArcelorMittal to release documents. Today, we're sitting at the Engen Oil Refinery, which is closed, no just transition. They're running, they're wanting to get out and leave that toxic land and leave people basically without employment in a wasteland. And they are not sharing the information that is requested of them. They write you letters telling you about how they could and how they would, but they don't actually provide that information. And that's really critical. So in terms of disclosure, I think there's a big challenge there. And so what we have done in South Africa and globally, you have to then turn movement action, people's actions, and the legal system. And we had to get the likes of the Thabametsi case going, which now has led to where EarthLife and the Center for Environmental Rights had to go to court. And it's now led to guidelines on the climate impact assessment. Those things need to be law. It doesn't only need to be guidelines. But the reality, when one looks at what is going down in terms of the Mabola area and how that mine is trying to force itself into the South African scene, into an economy where coal is dying, that, you have a very type of sad reality. So there's two more things I want to say, Jenny. My 15 minutes are nearly up. And one is that the critical thing is that there is still a very big push for dirty energy. And Sasol is number one. They will continue with coal. They're not going to reduce coal. And they're not going to reduce gas. Ask the Mozambicans. They are basically extracting that Mozambican gas, and they are doing whatever they want to. And by the way, in terms of disclosure of information, everybody know that Mexico, the sea was on fire the other day in Mexico. It was bubbling and burning. Exactly the same time, the Vaal River was bubbling because Sasol's ethane pipeline was leaking. Do you think Sasol released the information? They kept quiet. We had to force them, and still they haven't released all the information. So that's really critical to understand. The World Coal Association and Michel Manouk, just said the other day in a meeting in South Africa, we need the industry to speak up on behalf of coal. The mature, unemotional position needs to get louder. The coal is unemotional position. We call it raising the coal IQ. So I think, Jan, you guys at NBI face a huge challenge, and especially when that debate is then backed by South African businessmen who want to get onto the last grabs of this type of dirty energy economy. And the question is how do we make and how do we show that doesn't sink what is possibly a good, we might not agree on your full agenda, but what is probably a good starting agenda, one could say. But, I want to show one slide. So I just want my screen shared for 1 minute, because I think it's important to be able to highlight this. And, it's only by showing this visually that you get to the challenge we face. So today, as we sit here, we are looking at, oopsie, let me make sure that's what I want to share. Yes. Okay, if everybody, no, that's what happens when you have too many windows open. So I'm going to start the sharing again, Jenny. Apologies. So there's nothing better than a photo that explains the challenge we're facing. So I hope this is now going to work. And if it doesn't, I won't try and share it again. Are you seeing a fire? No, you're not. You're seeing something else. Are you seeing a fire now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, what is that? Is that Dante's hell that we're looking at? No, that ain't Dante's hell. That's an abandoned coal mine in Ermelo that is burning as we speak. And has been burning for the last 15 years. But we know the coal mines on the Highvelds have been burning probably, since the 30s maybe. And yet we haven't done anything about that. And then there's just one more slide I want to show, which I think is important to be able to recognize in terms of, and I hope this is it. No, I don't think it is. But essentially, when you look at big business response from Paris, where everybody celebrates it, we need to recognize that big, dirty business knew of the problem around energy for more than 50 years, and they've denied it, and they've created a lot of deceit around it. And since Paris, they spent more than the five major oil companies, including companies that probably on your team, have spent more than $1 billion in 3 years after the Paris Agreement on misleading climate-related branding and lobbying. And many of the corporations have actively opposed and lobbied against almost every single climate policy that would keep fossil fuels in the ground. And finally, I want to end off on this classic note. So Sasol the other day, and I hope there's some people from Sasol here, because I thought maybe I'm getting older and my sight was gone. The present minimum emission standards for a plant at Sasol is calling for 130 milligrams per cubic meter to be met at a new plant level of a VOC. Sasol puts in an MES to weaken that by 13,000 times. 13,000 times, from 130 milligrams for a new plant standard to more than 280,000 times. So from 130 milligrams to more than 280,000 milligrams. I mean, I looked at this. Is this crazy? Is this real? Am I blind? Is there a zero missing? No, it's not. That's what Sasol is actually doing. Thank you, Jenny.
Okay, thanks so much, Bobby. Wow, so the questions are coming, and I'm not used to you and Joanne finding common ground for so much of a discussion. So I was a little amazed for a while, but you did end up where one needed to be. I'm going to monopolize my place as facilitator of the session before we move into the questions to get a burning question of mine in, because it's an upcoming topic. And that's to solicit both of your views on jobs and environment. You know, this is a very old debate that comes from forever, which certainly in the South African context, but it's not unique, is that you can have jobs or the environment. And we have moved into a situation where you can have climate change mitigation, adaptation measures, or you can have the environment. And I know there's been a lot of academic studies overseas that say that's not the case. But as you both pointed out, we have the big coal industry and so on. So if I can ask Joanne to comment on that briefly, and then Bobby to respond. Do we do climate change, or do we save jobs, or can we do both?
Okay, I mean, my view is you have to do both. There isn't a choice, not in this country. So maybe to talk a little bit about what is happening in the coal industry, and I think there are probably three main responses to climate change in the coal industry. I think the first thing is that we are seeing we're seeing the sell-off of coal mines and the coal value chain by the big coal majors to smaller and newer players in the market is the one thing that is happening. So, for example, and so in a sense, what you're seeing is quite a lot of the historic coal miners divesting from coal. And they're doing that because they know that coal, the future of coal is limited. So Anglo has done that. Anglo's intention is to reach net zero by 2040 as a company. It has announced that target. It has sold its South African coal assets. It sold its coal assets in other parts of the world, and it's investing heavily in new technologies to be able to power its operations. It's also looking at the new minerals that are needed to be able to support the new technologies of the future. And so that is the one kind of response. I think the second thing that we're looking at is coal mining companies that see themselves remaining in the coal value chain for a period of time and then see themselves exiting. And so they're looking at transitioning strategies. So we have coal companies in South Africa that see themselves becoming players in the renewable energy space. That's the one very, very common response. The other one is coal companies that are looking at water and agriculture. Coal companies that are seeing themselves investing in all kinds of new and different technologies and eventually exiting coal. So seeing the kind of, and starting to engage with their workforce and look at how their workforces and the communities in the areas where they are based, what can be done to start creating new and different livelihoods. And there are quite a few big companies are doing that. And then there are the companies that I see that I think see themselves remaining in the coal sector until that sector is phased out of the economy. In the work that we are doing, we are proposing that in relation to the renewables overbuild that I spoke of, that you'd phase coal out by 2042. I think that many of the new coal investors see themselves as exporting until 2050. And I think it is important to understand that because there is a reluctance by investors worldwide to invest in new coal infrastructure, coal is going to become a scarce commodity. A lot of coal will stay in the ground because you won't be able to finance the infrastructure needed to be able to get it out of the ground. And so those operators who have coal infrastructure, I think are probably for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, I think it's going to be an extremely attractive industry in terms of generating returns. But it is an industry in decline, and I don't think there is anyone in South African business who is under any illusions that that is the case, whatever is said. And so I think that the question really is about, I think that we have seen in a very dramatic way over the last few weeks what happens when economic infrastructure is destroyed in random and chaotic ways, and the consequences that it has for everybody. And so for me, the approach that I really favor is looking at how do you build up the new while you phase down the old. And how do you do it in a way that is planned? And how do you do it in a way that is ordered? And how do you do it in a way that really puts in place a plan to develop the human capacity and the human potential of people to ensure that we don't lose livelihoods, that we don't worsen the economic conditions of people, that we don't fragment and dislocate and destroy communities, and that what we do is to try and work as a country towards something that is much better, much less harmful to the environment, that starts to build much better economic resilience, and that starts to do it in a way so that the benefits are spread much, much more broadly than what we've actually got at the moment. And I think that that is really the approach that I think would make sense. Jenny, can I answer one question, one issue that was raised in the chat, which was, there was a thing saying this sounds like old corporate CSI. So the kind of plan that we're talking about takes place in the context of quite a strict regulatory framework. Companies have to report on their GHG emissions. Companies have to, beyond above a certain level of emissions, are subject to a carbon tax, and that carbon tax is determined through quite a rigorous process the National Treasury goes through in order to assess and understand the levels of emissions and the extent to which emissions targets are or aren't being met. There's a carbon budget process that is underway where the large players in the economy are engaging with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment to be able to agree on what the carbon budget should be. It is in the new climate legislation that's about to be passed. And we are in the process of setting sector emission targets for different sectors of the economy. And those targets are mandatory and need to be met. So I think that all of that exists and is most of it, 90% of that exists. Some of it is still in development. But the regulatory framework that we have around climate change in this country is quite comprehensive. And the climate change bill that will come before Parliament later on this year is going to regulate that and make some of the things that are currently discretionary mandatory. So the work that we're doing is in that context and takes forward the regulatory framework into another level where you're starting to try and achieve climate change goals and aims in a way that goes far beyond what the regulatory framework actually requires. And I don't think in that way that this is just a kind of voluntary nice to have. I think that companies in South Africa are very aware of the risks that climate change poses. Things like extreme weather events, flash floods in the last couple of years have destroyed huge levels of mining infrastructure, for example. And companies know that this is not something that they can ignore, that it's not a sort of a nice to thing or something that is just about greenwashing. It impacts their core business in a very direct sense. And I think that's what some of the shift has been over the last 5 to 7 years, is the fact that it does impact core business, and for that reason has become central to the kinds of strategy that many corporates are putting forward.
Thanks, Joanne. And Bobby, you've now got 2 issues to respond to. Joanne always moves at lightning speed in her brain that I've got used to over years. So the one is my initial question on jobs. Yeah. The other is a response. I suppose the comment was really saying, are you greenwashing? You know, and do we have time to make all these platitudes with the 2050 ambitions? So Jan's given her response to that. So can you multitask?
Yeah, I mean, so this whole issue about net zero, I mean, you know, the reality is that we cannot fit all the carbon that has been emitted and still will be emitted and still is planned to be dug out into the natural carbon cycle. I mean, we way beyond that. We needed to stop this thing 20 years ago. We can't be speaking about business stopping it in 10, 15, 20 years from now. We also need to recognize that this negative type of emission technology that is being pushed, the question has to be asked by business and by government. Why isn't it happening? You know, everybody said, well, it's going to happen in 2050, next half of the century, we're going to do this. No, CCS doesn't work. You know, offsetting doesn't work. You know, carbon trading does not work. These are false solutions. And I think businesses hanging on to those just in order to eke out as much time as possible to continue the profit process. And the reality is, we are clear as the environmental justice movement. We have to keep oil in the soil and coal in the hole and gas under the land. I think it's important. We cannot dig up any more fossil fuel, and yet we're talking about Sasol doing that now. We're talking about expansion of coal mines. So, you know, I think there's a real problem in this debate. I don't agree with Joanne that our climate legislation is strong and it's comprehensive. You know, Joanne has been in government herself. She knows it. I'm not going to. We know that the climate legislation is not here. And even when it comes here, you know, it's going to literally not be tight enough, pointed enough, so that somebody goes to court and that somebody goes to jail if they allow their company to continue allowing the ethane to leak out of the gas pipeline under the Vaal River. Why? Because that person can phone President Ramaphosa up and have a powerful conversation with President Ramaphosa, whereas communities can't. Communities don't have access to information. All of this stuff is at a level that does not impact upon people on the ground. In terms of jobs and a new economy, we have to think of jobs in a situation where we're sitting with 50% unemployment, right? I know that people fight about figures that could go as high as 60, it could go as high as 30. Say we're sitting with 50% unemployment, right? We need a livelihood strategy for South Africa. We need a job strategy for South Africa that does not only depend upon big industry. So I think there has to be, in a just transition, a type of rethinking of our economy so that it services people. There are livelihoods. And so, you know, groundwork talks about energy democracy. People talk about social ownership of energy. All these things need to be put into the system so it's not extractive. We need a regenerative economy, and it's happening. So you're having people in this crisis in KwaZulu-Natal moving agricultural products quickly. You have people in Mabola that, you know, have planted maize and have harvested 10 tons of maize rather than mine the land. So there are possibilities. You have possibilities in Wakkerstroom where you have a local Uber type of transport courier system set up by a local person in Wakkerstroom that has got nothing to do with corporates, that services poor people living in townships. That is the new economy that we need to think of. And we can't be fixating on, is the industry going to provide the jobs? Because we know that Engen Oil Refinery has been cutting jobs since 1994, and they're now cutting all the jobs. The coal industry and mining essentially have been losing jobs. And what for me is the biggest scare that we're going to be faced coming in the future is as we move to renewable energy, two things. We cannot get the type of, you know, Eskom power, the 40, 50, you know, gigs of power or gigawatt power via renewables. You just don't have enough land, you don't have enough steel, you don't. What we need to think of is how do we, and this is where Joanne probably and industry will work well, is efficiency, but it's also consumption. How do you and it's, people say, oh, there goes the lefty again about consumption. No, it's an important issue. We need to think and talk about consumption as we move to a new energy system, because we cannot just think we'll recreate the old energy system with renewable energy. No, because the second thing on that is is that the people in the Limpopo area, where there are the platinum group minerals, and the people on the south coast in KwaZulu-Natal, where there's lithium, those are going to be, those two areas are going to be like Mpumalanga, and already Limpopo is like Mpumalanga. So mining is going to happen for renewable energy, and people will still die. So renewable energy could also be a serious problem going forward. You're on mute, Jenny.
Unmute, sorry. I can see we can get stuck on that question alone. So let me give our chat participants a chance. We've got Gillian who says, why do we see so much reluctance and lagging from the finance sector in aligning to the Paris Agreement? I think, Joanne, that might be a question for you.
Gillian.
Okay, so my question, I suppose, would be which finance sector? Because I think that the finance sector is probably the financial services sector broadly, I think is in fact has been instrumental in changing the pattern of investment in fossil fuels. And I think that if you look at the financial services sector in South Africa, I think it has taken time, but I think there is an increasing momentum with all of the banks. Big banks at this point in time have policies around phasing themselves out of their fossil fuel investments. And most of them won't invest, for example, in coal into the future. And they've set end points for that investment. And that's in South Africa. I think that we're in fact the lifeblood of a lot of the banking sector for decades and decades has been investment in those sectors. Internationally, exactly the same, and the same with the asset managers, the equity investors. They are all building portfolios of investments that are pulling them very, very rapidly out of fossil fuels. Same for the pension funds. So there is a divestment out of fossil fuel move internationally, and I think that the financial service sector is quite instrumental in it. And I think that the kind of work that has been done by organizations like UNEP, FI, and a number of the international associations of stock exchanges, some of the work that has been done by in the PRI have all pushed that internationally and created, I suppose, frameworks that in different parts of the world and in different countries banks have taken up. So I'm pretty certain that pretty much all big financial services investors in South Africa see themselves into the future investing in big renewables portfolio more than anything else, and into electric vehicles and into green hydrogen and into the kinds of technologies that we don't even know exist yet.
Bobby, I'm going to be unfair because the questions are coming and I want us to get through all of them. Quick reply from you. Do you agree or not agree?
Sorry, I was lost. I was looking at the questions, Joanne. Jenny, just refresh me quickly.
I'm just saying in terms of the question of that the finance sector is behind in aligning to the Paris Agreement. Joanne is suggesting that actually they are getting on board. There has been a massive shift.
Well, there's been a massive shift, but there's a very big gray area because, you know, with the gray area of net zero itself, you're having these the financial sector making decisions about, well, you know, it will be left up to local and the global type of major funders, state funders are saying, well, it'll be left up to local governments, or not local governments, national governments in terms of what they want. And that's how we will invest. So it's still very fluid there. And in terms of the financial sector, it's not clear cut. I think there is pressure, but our financial sector in South Africa hasn't signed off unconditionally that they will stop. There are still many gray areas in this process. So the two gray areas is one, is that at a global level of multilateral type of spending, dirty energy is still on the cards. It's just defined differently, and it's pushed differently, and it's specifically, you turn to say, oh, we can't tell a national government what to do, so we'll listen to what they want. And the Eskom case was a classic, where they said, well, we'll follow local law in South Africa around Eskom and Medupi. They gave us the money and the law failed us. And then the banks, as I said, the banks are not clear 100% that they will stop on coal. It's still vary, and they need to be pushed much harder, but it's not stopping on coal only. It's really stopping on fossil fuels, full stop. And there has to be a move on that. And it cannot be that the banks then move into the renewable energy to eke out profits there, because then it's just this whole financialization and getting profits through financial transactions is not going to work. And somebody asked, where would we get the money for all of this? I think, we have to be creative. We have to go back to the discussion around the Tobin tax and things like that, in terms of where to find money in these processes. And do we tax the big oil companies and their shareholders in the processes of continuing seeking out new finds?
Okay. I'm going to move on. Colleen Vogel, and she's a co-host, I'm sure, as one of our organizers, so she can chip in. But when Joanne was talking, she asked a question saying, what about the adaptation section? Adaptation sector and adaptation of options. You got a comment on that, Joanne?
Yeah, okay, so I think I focused pretty much on the work that has been done on the energy sector. But as I said, have done some quite intensive work in relation to the agriculture, forestry, and land use sectors, and are working with the South African National Biodiversity Institute to develop a pipeline of projects that the private sector, adaptation projects that the private sector can invest in. And I think that the issues of climate impacts are huge for the private sector, huge for the agricultural sector, huge for the forestry sector, but very big in terms of infrastructure and starting to build the resilience and climate-proof our infrastructure. And so an organization like Transnet, for example, has done some really outstanding work on looking at the climate risks related to the ports, the harbors, rail infrastructure, the viability of their operations in relation to climate change. There's been a lot of work done in the mining sector around the impacts of increasing temperatures on the viabilities of their operations, on the risks that poses for their workers, on what they're going to need to do in order to climate-proof their operations. So Colleen, it is a huge issue, and we shouldn't, I don't think that it's not something to be minimized. In fact, it needs a conversation on its own. And I think that internationally as well, within the climate conversation internationally, the issue of mitigation takes precedence. And certainly in that, the African continent, and as a whole, and South Africa included, has been trying very hard, along with other groupings like the small island developing states and the least developed countries and others, to be able to try and elevate the adaptation issue, and also ensure that the same level of resources that goes into mitigation is actually provided for adaptation. And at the recent ministerial, one of the ministerials leading up to the COP that was held in London last week, don't know if you saw that, Minister Creasy proposed a global goal on adaptation in order to essentially balance the equation. I mean, I think that we do need to recognize that this issue of just transition and the issue of the impact of climate change on livelihoods is not something that is limited to the coal industry. So workers in the agricultural sector, in the biodiversity economy, people working in the water sector, are all incredibly subject to the consequences of climate change. And I think that part of the adaptation solution in South Africa is going to be able to develop the kinds of solutions and build the resilience that is going to be necessary in order that people can build different kinds of livelihoods, and that the levels of vulnerability that they are increasingly trying to function in those sectors are also addressed as priorities. So I kind of do think that we tend to focus very much on the industrial economy. There's a very big focus at the moment, understandably, on the consequences for the phase out of coal and on the mining sector. But I think that there is a very huge issue in our country where some of the poorest people, people who are the poorest of the poor, are going to be the hardest hit unless we pay a huge amount of attention to what can actually be done to reinforce them and support their capacity to generate livelihoods.
Okay. I've got to go quickly now because we've got 15 minutes and so many questions. Bobby, do you want a quick injection? Because there's a lot of people wanting to hear from both of you.
A quick response in terms of adaptation. If we continue separating out mitigation and adaptation, we're in trouble. And I think, how can we have adaptation if we continue allowing the expansion of the fossil fuel industry in Mpumalanga? Minister Creasy can call for all the adaptation she wants to, but if she at the same time allowing further fossil fuel expansion, then it's of no use.
Okay. The next question I'm going to start with Bobby comes from Richard Worthington. Is South Africa not at risk of missing the opportunity to market our mitigation potential as a hook for concessionary finance inter alia for our electricity system if we do not table an aggressive decarbonization program, if all we offer is low-hanging fruit?
Yeah,
Bobby, do you want to take a crack at that first?
I mean, the talk of the town is if you do come up with a good plan, that the world will turn in and say, okay, now we can do something. And the failure by, I guess, those that make these plans in South Africa is that they've waited too long. I mean, we asked Eskom, Richard, in 2016, you're going to be closing those power stations in 2020. What are your plans? And they came back to us 9 months later and said, there are no plans. So I think, Richard, yes, if we got this very narrow window of opportunity around financial support, but we really need to move with a plan, and it's not about low-hanging fruit. It is about being aggressive, and it is about making sure that that plan speaks to people and, the issues around adaptation, service delivery. We need to link that to delivery of services to people.
Joanne, do you want a quick word on that?
Oh, very quickly. I absolutely agree, Richard. And I think that is why certainly business has agreed that the current NDC is not sufficiently ambitious, and why the kind of work that we are doing, we are hoping will feed into the development of a national plan and vision that will really enable South Africa to aggressively go out and to mobilize this window of finance that exists and will probably only exist for a short while.
Okay, I am skipping a bit, Gillian, apologies, because I gave you a question, so I'm going to move on. There was some support for Bobby. And there's a Koile Monaheng. To echo Bobby on the disclosure for whom point, this serves as an important reminder and recognition of stakeholders who are, sorry, my screen's not playing ball. Does the MBI and BUSA plan to have any inclusion for youth dialogue and participation with business, taking into consideration the importance of intergenerational justice? The reality is that major decision makers and CEOs who remain the sole orchestrators of youth will either be deceased or retired by 2050, and where will the youth be?
Okay, so the answer is yes. We run an intergenerational dialogue series in the NBI that doesn't only deal with climate change, but that deals with a wide range of issues of concern to youth, organized by youth in my own organization and in the company members that we have. And we also interact with quite a lot of, have engaged in this work with quite a lot of members of some of the youth organizations working in the climate space. So you're absolutely central and critical to the work that we do.
Okay. Then we've got Harold Winkler asking, how will the accelerated phase out of coal-fired power and social justice be funded? By international climate finance or domestic investment, and who determines what activities are financed? I'm going to start with Joanne and give Bobby a right of reply.
Okay, Harold, that's a $1 million question, and I know you're working in various projects on this transition. I think that is something that I would hope. It's fundamental to the mandate of the Presidential Climate Commission to be able to get a grip on this issue of the just transition, how it should unfold, who should be involved, how decisions should be made, and to advise government on that. So I would sincerely hope that, because it is a multi-stakeholder body that does bring together people from all sets of sectors, that it could be a place where some of those kind of hard conversations and negotiations could be held, but in a way where we genuinely try and find the consensus that would enable that to move forward. I think it is probably the appropriate place and the place in government that is mandated to actually do that work and come up with a plan that is workable for all. Clearly, everybody in making that plan is going to have to compromise at some level or another, but I don't see anywhere else where you could do it.
Bobby.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what the question Richard asked. I think we can't just expect the money to come from abroad. I think there's a lot of inequity in South Africa, which we need to recognize, and we need to be able to deal with. How do we shift money in South Africa and to be able to make sure that we then respond to a just transition in terms of all the components of a just transition, including, and I keep on saying this word, service delivery, because people on the ground, they're not worried about climate change. They worry about, am I getting water? Have I got some land to grow food on? Have I got a house that I'm not going to boil in summer and freeze in winter? You have to be able to tackle that within the just transition, with the energy and with the climate debate. And the importance is that the money has to be from within South Africa. We need to recognize we can't shift money and can't get money. And number two is, where is it placed? Yeah, I mean, I don't know where the ideal space would be. You know, will it be the Presidential Commission? Will it be government in terms of what they have to do? Government has to govern. We can advise. At the end of the day, somebody's going to take a decision. And I think we need to find out as society how we put pressure, not only on commissioners and through the commission, but how do we put pressure on government to govern? Because they're going to go away and take that decision. And critically, we must hold governments accountable to say, okay, you've taken that decision. Now come back and explain to us what informed that decision. And that's what industry and government and EIA practitioners do not want to do.
Okay, that resonates with a comment by Brandon, which I'm not going to explore because I think you've touched on it, saying we need the Climate Change Act. I think we've expressed views of, yes, we need regulation, and other views of saying how ambitious will the regulation be. And Richard's replied, sorry, I'm racing, guys. We've got like 5 minutes and so many questions. Eugene Cancross, question for Joanne. Joanne, you posited hydrogen production as an opportunity and part of transition. I assume you're strictly referring to green hydrogen, which should be produced from surplus renewable energy, and any diversion of new renewable energy capacity to the production of hydrogen will simply prolong our dependence on fossil energy. Why are you proposing to divert limited financial research and production capacity to hydrogen production now? Sorry, my screen is frozen. Do you accept that?
Yeah, short answer, Jenny. I am talking about green hydrogen. I'm not talking about any other kind of hydrogen production. And that is where kind of this issue of an integrated reindustrialization strategy comes from. On the one hand, overbuilding renewables. On the other hand, looking at the opportunities for new value chains, new commodities that could be produced as a consequence and linked to that.
Okay. And just so that Bobby gets an even-handed response from Eugene, he says that Bobby agrees we should pay attention to energy efficiency. There's more than enough sun, wind, and land and energy. Right, Narissa Anku, energy conservation is the most cost-effective and true way to reduce greenhouse gases. It is a desirable tool. Oh, apologies, everyone, I'm struggling with my screen. That limits GHG emissions by ensuring that energy demand grows at a reducing rate and saves the cost. Okay, that's a comment. I'm going to look for a last question or two.
I just want to say, Jenny, the question right at the end is about mining. And I think it's a very important recognition that we have such a poor track record in mining in South Africa. The gold mines, the coal mines, the asbestos mines, you know, I can go on and I can go on, and the abandoned mines, people dying underground. And that's going to be our biggest challenge going forward with the renewable energy process.
Okay. I'm devastated that we can't get through all the questions, but to those of you who are interested in what the minister's got to say, there's a couple of points there. She will be our speaker in the 9th seminar. So please do join us and you can raise all of that there, and then I haven't silenced you. I think what I would like to do, because we've got just a couple of minutes remaining, is to just ask Joanne and Bobby to have their last thoughts. They've also been able to scroll through the chat box if there's anything that they need to say. And because I'm a lawyer, I'm also going to ask that you touch on the point of how important is the role of litigation in climate change?
We haven't had much climate change litigation in South Africa. I think that certainly the work that the CER has done around mining and air quality has shifted the conversation in those areas, and no doubt the climate litigation will come. I mean, I would be very interested to understand how, in our context, whether it would be litigation related to the progressive realization of the Bill of Rights, and how the courts would understand that notion of progressive realization of socioeconomic rights. So I think there's some quite interesting legal debates, but we'll have to wait for the litigation to be generated and to see how the courts are going to respond. But I think there is a bigger issue, which is that this, on all sides of this conversation, as there always are in these conversations around climate change in South Africa at the moment, you've got everybody agreeing that this is a problem that belongs to all of us, and that all of us have to play our part in, and that we have to ensure that the solutions are solutions that we can all buy into and live with. But the discourse, and it's a South African discourse, is increasingly a discourse where you've got to set yourself up in opposite sets of the room. And so I think there is a process thing, which is that how are we going to find the ways to hold these conversations in a way that people can hear each other, can hear each other's concerns, can take them seriously, and can find solutions that, to the greatest extent possible, are able to take into account the interests of all. Now, some of that might sound a bit naive, but I truly believe that in relation to this issue, it is the only way that we are actually going to move forward, number one, and the only way that we are actually going to see any kind of change on the ground. So I think that for me is the very big concern. And it requires people who sit in very different parts of society, coming from very different experiences, with very different access to power, with very different understandings of the world, to find common ground. So I think the climate conversation has got to really be about that. How do we find the common ground that is going to enable the change we want?
So,
Bobby, over to you.
yeah, so progressive realization, I think section 24 says we will protect people, health, and the environment while we have development. I think the debate, the legal debate is out there, Jenny, whether it's progressive or whether it's the only section in the environment in the Constitution that says what development will be, and it will be, sustainable. And so I think that's really important to go into that. I think there's a lot of agreement, Joanne. I think, we do have different positions, but this debate between us has shown that we can agree on certain things. In terms of litigation, Groundwork is Friends of the Earth South Africa, and we're part of the big Friends of the Earth family globally. And Friends of the Earth, the Netherlands, and Friends of the Earth Nigeria had to take Shell to court. And the Friends of the Earth Netherlands won the case where the Dutch government has forced Shell to come up with a plan to reduce. So legal action is important, but Friends of the Earth is a movement. It's the biggest grassroots movement in the world. So you cannot have litigation without movement. Litigation is a tool that has to be pointed, to be used, and then it will be really, really effective. So for me, that's important. As a colleague said to me the other day, he said to me, when you get into court with a lawyer, maybe that lawyer has failed you. You have to get the solution before you get to court. I think it's a bit of both. You have to get to court to really shire the people that are doing wrong. South Africa, that means hit people if there's an international audience. And yes, you also need good legal advice to make sure that they're part of your campaign throughout. Thank you.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to say to both of you, as we move into our next sectors of NGOs and labor and youth, please join us because you've got so much to contribute. So I am sorry that it became so lively we couldn't get to everybody. I am grateful personally that both of you are sitting on that presidential commission because of your experience and your insights and so on. And it just remains for me to thank you very much for the time and thank you.
Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you.
Thanks from my side, and any people can show their appreciation in the chat and also by using the jazz hands function as well. Thank you to Joanne and to Bobby. We really, I think, saw tonight how there can be difference, but difference that is kind of productive as well. And there's common ground, and there's also importance of actually challenging each other. And I think that was really an example of that. So we really appreciate both your time and look forward to the next one, which will engage with the role of civil society. So everyone from my side, good night.
Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good one.
Thank you so much.